All right, John chapter 11. Let's call this one the resurrection. As I always want to pause and thank God. This time, just thanking God for giving us a chance to get this far through the Gospels, praying his blessings, God willing, on guiding us as far as he will guide us through the rest of the Bible. But I want to call this chapter the resurrection because, as we mentioned in the last chapter, it's going to involve the resurrection of Lazarus, which is going to allow Jesus to make the point that, along the line of his I am statements, this time he is going to help them to understand that he is the resurrection that empowers the resurrection, the physical resurrection of Lazarus in this chapter that starts out in the first 4 verses, letting us know the dilemma, and that is that Lazarus has fallen ill, reminding us that Lazarus, or letting us know that Lazarus is the brother of Martha and Mary, all 3 of whom Jesus loves. But like we saw back in chapter 9, there's going to be a purpose statement behind this situation in which Lazarus has fallen ill, where, similar to the man who was blind from birth, it was not so much because either that man or his parents sinned that he was blind, but so that the power and the purpose of God could be demonstrated in what Christ was going to do for the man. Likewise, Lazarus' illness is so that God's purpose and power can help to make a larger point for all those who are going to soon become aware of what God is able to do, as verses 5 through 16 are going to help us to understand that in spite of getting the news that Lazarus is ill, Jesus is going to wait, verse 7, helping us to understand, however, that they are going to go. But before they can go, the apostles are going to notice, wait a minute, if we go back there, that's the place where they were just trying to kill you, at which point Jesus in verse 9 is going to help them understand that they have to work while they have the opportunity, because the opportunity for him to be there in the flesh is not forever. And this is the proper time to go back and help Lazarus, which is exactly what they are going to do. Verse 16, helping to show the level of commitment of his apostles, as Thomas, the one who will eventually be known for his doubts, is going to seem to make a strong statement of courage and faith, saying, essentially, I guess, even if he has to die, let us go die with him. Verses 17 through 27, going on to show that as he approaches Bethany, the place where Lazarus has fallen ill and now died, his sister Martha is going to come out to meet the Christ, stating that if he had, meaning if the Christ had been there, Lazarus wouldn't have had to die. A level of faith that's commendable, but he is going to challenge her to raise the level on her faith, stating that, as we mentioned, he, Jesus, is the resurrection, asking, does she believe that? Mustering what seems to be all the faith that you could reasonably expect a person to have under that level of grief, she's going to at least acknowledge that, yes, she believes that he is the Christ, not parroting his language or repeating his language, suggesting that she's struggling to fully understand or believe what he's saying. She at least believes that he is the Christ, as in verses 28 and forward, going through to verse 37, we're going to see her go to let her sister Mary know that the Christ is there and calling for her, at which point Mary is quickly going to get up and go to the Christ, followed by some of those who were there mourning with her, or there with her as she mourned. And that section where she goes to meet the Christ is going to seem to be at least characterized by the weeping, as her weeping is going to be described in, I think it is verse 33, and then it is likewise going to lead to the very famous verse, one of the shortest, if not the shortest verses in the Bible, that simply says in verse 35, Jesus wept, leading to verses 36 and 37, where the crowds are going to notice, look, how much he cared for Lazarus. But similar to Martha and Mary's belief that if the Christ had been there, their brother would not have had to die, part of the crowd is going to question, couldn't this man who's done so many other miracles have prevented this man from dying? Which is going to introduce Christ's ability to make a larger point than what he has made in the past. As one of the brothers corrected me on Wednesday night, or after Wednesday night class, when I think I said he was about to raise the level by raising the dead. This was not the first time he has raised the dead, but it is going to be a level up from the way he has done it in the past, when we saw back in Luke chapter 7, I think it was, where he raised the widow's son who was in the coffin. Likewise, in chapter 8, where he raised Jairus' daughter who was ill but passed on his way to go heal the young lady. In the famous story where the woman who touched the hem of his garment got her healing on the way. The official, Jairus' daughter, died on the way, and he was able to raise her soon after she had passed. This is different because his delay, what seems to be his intentional delay, allowed Lazarus to be in the tomb for 4 days, something that Mary brings to his attention, which is going to seem to enhance not only the degree of the miracle, but the degree of wonder that the crowd is going to experience when they see what happens in verses 38 through 44, as Jesus is going to issue a number of statements or commands. In verse 39, he's going to say, "Take away the stone," leading Mary to raise the question, oh, he's been in the tomb for 4 days. There'll have to be an odor, at which point he is going to issue the statement, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" At which point, after a few more verses, he is going to make a command or a statement to Lazarus, "Lazarus, come out." At which point, Lazarus is going to come out in verse 44, at which point he is going to issue the final order or statement to unbind him and let him go, provoking the wonder that will take us through to the conclusion of the chapter. Once again, dividing the crowd, verses 45 through 57, the end of the chapter, starting out in verse 45, saying that many therefore believed in him. However, verse 46 is going to say that some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done, provoking repentance in the Pharisees and chief priests. Of course not. No, because they are going to fixate on the cost to themselves, understanding that they're in a mindset where any win that Jesus seems to get is going to feel like it's necessarily a loss for them, failing to realize or even care, as we've seen in the previous Gospels, that a win for Christ is like we're seeing here. It's a win for the people, even to the degree he is raising their dead. But that is not that is not factoring into the calculus of the chief priests and Pharisees, who are going to convene and specifically in verse 48 say, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation, helping us to understand that beyond all of the doctrinal issues that are kind of the pretense for their friction with the Christ, the bottom line is they feel like they're taking an L anytime he seems to get a win, even though fundamentally he's not in competition with any of them. Understanding that, though, they are going to listen to Caiaphas, one of them, prophesy or remind them that he has prophesied, that their frustration is moot because it's better that one die on behalf of the nation than all have to suffer. Him having prophesied that, you would think that they would simply take their hands off and simply allow nature to take its course, but they are going to be motivated even more to actually make him the sacrifice so that they don't have to suffer. Going on, though, it is going to show that in verses 52 through 53, they are going to make plans to put him to death. In verse 54, constricting his ability to move freely. He definitely doesn't have to limit his movement, but verse 54 is going to show that he is no longer going to walk openly, but withdraw to a region in Ephraim, where he is going to stay with his disciples, as the chapter is going to close out with what seems to be a cliffhanger, as the chief priests and the Pharisees have given orders that if anyone knows where he is, they should let them know that he might be arrested. The question for the crowd is going to be, will he show up to the feast of Passover, understanding the fact that there's an arrest order out after him. This chapter, in which, as we have mentioned, Christ identifies himself as the resurrection, likewise shows him resurrecting Lazarus to emphasize that point, unfortunately reminded me of the way that unhealthy environments can prevent us or create unnecessary burdens on us functioning at our God-given potential, reminding me of things that Christ has taught in the previous Gospels, in Luke chapter 23, talking about one of the ways in which the environment created unhealthy burdens on the people of Israel at the time of the Passover and the triumphal entry, as John will go on to describe in his version of the life of Christ. And then likewise, Luke will also describe the way that earlier in his ministry, when he is talking about the scribes, he will likewise talk about the way that they have tied up heavy burdens on the people, burdens hard for the people to bear that the scribes are unwilling to share. And likewise, here in John chapter 11, after Jesus has demonstrated the ability to even raise the dead, the environment in Jerusalem at that time provides unnecessary burdens to all of the blessings that he could otherwise provide in Jerusalem at that time, reminding me that as much as I try to avoid sports metaphors, we are in NBA playoff season. And even though the best team on earth, the Golden State Warriors, are no longer in contention for the title, one of the things that I reference from time to time is, I think it's their newest addition, Jimmy Butler, who famously found a fit with the Golden State Warriors after probably just as famously struggling under the constraints in which he found himself playing in Miami. And it reminded me that even beyond the constraints that he found himself playing in Miami and the joy that he seemed to have restored in the freedom that he found in Golden State, there still remained what we from time to time describe as the perils of success, as Jimmy seemed to have a measured response to the new fit he had with his team. However, it inspired at least one of his teammates to probably go too far in declaring that this seemed like this was their year. And I'm dumbing it down a little bit because he literally said this was their year to win the championship, creating probably two mistakes. One, forgetting that injuries are a thing that it's hard to really control. And then likewise, one of the things they typically tell teams is try not to unnecessarily offer your adversaries bulletin board material. And in that one statement, he seemed to go beyond offering other teams bulletin board material to offering the refs bulletin board material, as the officiating was notoriously slack in a way that caused some to realize that this is the kind of officiating that actually gets folks hurt. And eventually that's what happened. Jimmy himself, even though he wasn't the one doing the bragging about winning the championship this year, eventually it got so physical that Jimmy eventually got hurt. And even though he came back from his injury, Steph famously went down in a non-contact injury that probably had nothing to do with the officiating. But either way, Golden State's season reminded me that life is tough enough without self-imposed adversity. But likewise reminds me that in chapter 11, much of Israel's progress or potential in those days was actually limited by self-imposed adversity. Some that came by the hands of those who were unable to rejoice with the Christ and those he was able to help. But some actually came from those who Christ was able to help. Some who were too encouraged by his potential as a king to fully embrace all of the responsibilities that went along with carrying his cross. Which is why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, please guide us out of the temptation to get in our own